How many years have you been coaching? 5, 10, 15, 30 years? Probably the more important question is, how many years of coaching experience do you have? Do you have that many years of coaching experience, or do you have 1 year repeated that many times? I've always appreciated this thought exercise. I think experience in leadership is both undervalued and at the same time overrated. Like, people don't value enough how some things must be experienced to be understood. And you can't apply the things you learn on this podcast and books or in workshops and seminars without real world experience. You can't develop skills without real world experience. At the same time, I don't think that we learn enough from our experience. The truth is, we don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience, as the great thinker John Dewey used to say. How we reflect on our practices, our games, and on a whole season is very important. We need to have an intentional process, and that's what we're going to discuss in today's podcast. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nerman, the founder of TOC. I'm joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. The mission of this podcast is to provide actionable ways for you to grow as a leader and to improve your team's culture. To get the notes to this episode, as well as to our weekly newsletter sharing thoughts and strategies on leadership and culture, head on over to tocculture.com. Also, if you are looking to further invest in your leadership and your team's culture, beyond just listening to this podcast, check out my book, The Culture System. It's available at Amazon and on Audible. It's full of practical ways to build your culture, as well as some case studies and some other unique stories that will help you to put these ideas into practice. All right, let's get right into today's conversation.
Well, JP, at the time of this recording, it's the end of February. The postseason state tournaments are just around the corner here for a lot of winter sports. And for many of us, this is the end of a season and the start of a new season, the reflection season, as we begin to look back on things that went well or things that didn't go well or things that we wish would have gone better. And when it comes to the postseason autopsy, when we're going back through the way things went, I think a lot of times coaches sort of default to a couple of mechanisms. Number one, there's a lot of people out there that will just go back through the film. You know, over the course of the coming months, they'll watch all their games, they'll take notes, they'll chart possessions, they'll try to figure out, what were we good at? What situations did we struggle in? And start to formulate a plan to be able to address some of those weaknesses going into next season. Some coaches will just take their administrator's evaluation and try to figure out, how do I take these does not meet expectation marks and move them up to meets expectations next year so that they get off my back for another season. Some will look at their email inbox and get some gracious suggestions from parents, and follow the same principles, right? How can I fix this next year so the parents will stay off of my back? But as our season just recently came to an end, I'm challenged in some unique ways or some different ways to start thinking through what happened during our season. And one of the things that's really challenged me this year is a book by Annie Duke, and I know we've referenced this on the podcast before, called Thinking in Bets. And she talks about how making decisions, whether it's in sports or anything else, is a lot like a poker player, right? There's information at the table when you're making a bet that you know what the cards are on your hand. Maybe you know what the cards are face up on the table. You don't necessarily know for sure what your opponents have or what cards are coming up next, but all of those variables are going to impact the outcome of that hand. And so as she sort of unpacks this philosophy in the book, one of the things that's been challenging to me is to start thinking through this lens. I go back to my season and I look at decisions that we made, and I'm trying to figure out, what information did I have in that situation? What information did I not have, but I knew that I didn't have it? In other words, we're getting ready to play an opponent, and we weren't sure if they were going to play man or zone, and I'm not sure how I could have figured that out. It's going to matter in the long run. It's obviously going to matter in the game, and so we have to account for what we don't know, but there isn't necessarily a way to find out for sure what that coach is thinking prior to the game starting. But there's another category that Duke talks about that is the one that's really captured my attention. And that is, what are the pieces of information that are going to be relevant to that decision that you did not have at the time, and you didn't know that you didn't have them at the time. What's the missing information that maybe we could have had to make a better decision, but we didn't because we didn't know where to find it? In other words, if you're thinking at a poker table, I'm looking across the table at my opponents. Maybe there's a tell there, that they're bluffing, that later I find out, oh, when they take a bite of an Oreo cookie, that means that they don't have a great hand. But I didn't know that at the time. And I think it's focusing on the missing information that maybe I could have had that's starting to make me even rethink the questions I want to ask my players in their exit interviews, and the questions that I want to ask of my coaches, and even how I'm reviewing film and practices from the season. Not so much necessarily about effective or not effective, efficient or not efficient, but what was the information that was clear now that I'm looking back on it that I didn't see at the time.
Yeah. So I love this structure you're building out to reflect on some of your decision making. I'm sure that's not just tactical decisions, scouting type decisions. It's cultural stuff, things that you do with the team, even just your processes around practices and stuff like that. You're very reflective and you review a lot of different things. I look at, where we are now, me and you and our work with coaches and the process that we take the coaches that we work with in our one-on-one coaching program through. And it is nothing, nothing like, my process, 6-7 years ago when I was coaching high school basketball. I was, after the season, I was just going to go into hiding and they, look at the film and review all my decisions and all the problems and the things that didn't go the way that I want them to go. And I would just try to troubleshoot it, much like I troubleshoot any, household issue, whether my computer breaks, the TV breaks, or anything, the sink, I have a leaky sink. I just try different things until something works, right? And so I feel like, for years as a coach, I have these problems and these issues, or, that would come up, and I review them at the end of the year, and I'd be like, all right, well, next year, I guess we can try this, we just try something new. And I really wouldn't take the time to gather information and then to sift through that information, which is what I think you're talking about there, is to really sift through the reflection piece. And now in our work with coaches, I mean, they're sending out Google Forms to players, sometimes to parents, sometimes to administrators or even teachers, and they're asking for feedback. And then they're going through that feedback in a very intentional way. And I think that's one of the big mistakes that I see coaches, make in this reflection process, is they don't gather multiple data points. They don't gather enough data to then reflect on. They kind of just do it a lot internally, or maybe just with a few people on their staff. And then it's like, okay, well, what's the next thing we can try next year? And so there's not a lot of intentionality in this reflection process. And so I think what we're really going to try to give coaches today are some different questions and maybe a slightly different structure to go through that review process.
Well, I think what you're describing there, JP, is pretty common for all of us when we're coming out of a season. And oftentimes it's emotional for us as coaches in the same way that a post-game talk might be emotional. We think we knew what happened. We feel like our press didn't work, or we turned the ball over so much, or we didn't play hard. Then we go back and watch the film and we come to practice tomorrow and we say, hey guys, I got it wrong. This is what really happened when I watched the tape. I feel like that's kind of what happens at the end of a season. A lot of times we feel like this is the explanation for why we weren't as successful as we wanted to be. These were the problems, but without really opening the hood and starting to do a real diagnostic look at all the parts of the engine, so to speak, sometimes we can miss some really important areas that deserve more attention than maybe what we felt like coming out of the season. And I think that's what we're talking about here today, is how do we start to go through things with a little bit more intentionality, to not just be distracted by the problems, the leaky sinks and the faucets that won't turn off, but how do we really take a...
So I'm willing to bet here, Nate, that there is information that you missed this last season that's probably, bugging you a little bit. So is there an example that you could share here today with the listeners to kind of help them understand, what Annie Duke's talking about and this information that we missed that we maybe shouldn't have missed?
I can think of a number of examples just kind of off the top of my head here, JP. Let's take an in-game example. I remember we played in a game in January, and one of our guards was face guarded defensively. So they just denied her the ball. She wasn't our best player. She's a pretty good shooter. And at the time, I didn't recognize the defensive coverage in the game. And I remember afterwards, one of my assistants coming up to me and saying, boy, that was just a tough one. We just didn't know what to do with E because she was face guarded, and then that slowed down the ball, and we couldn't reverse it because she's moving through the offense. And I thought, I didn't even recognize that she was the only one being face guarded, And so that was a real eye opener for me to start thinking about what else am I missing during games, that I can go back and see on film, and why aren't I seeing those things in live play? So that's a lens that I'm really trying to use when I go back and watch some of our own film. But it's not just things that are, have to do with tactics or have to do with in-game adjustments. I mean, I can think of an example of a player that had a parent that reached out to us just to say, hey, my daughter's a little bit frustrated. Can you talk to her? Well, she had been frustrated for about 2 weeks. And so I didn't realize this until the parent reached out, and I appreciate the fact that they did because it led to a good conversation. But now I'm asking myself, what did we miss 2 weeks prior to that if we would have asked the right question in a one-on-one or followed up when we changed the substitution pattern in a little bit better way, could that have prevented 10 days of frustration and disappointment from this kid if I would have just been a little more attentive to how she responded to a couple decisions that we made? How did I miss it, right? That's the question I keep coming back to. How did I miss what I know now in the moment where it could have made the most difference when I'm making some of those decisions? And I've never really thought through that lens because I'm typically doing exactly what you described. She was frustrated. What do we have to do so she's happy next year? Rather than what was my role in not responding better, and how did I miss it so that I can be better equipped next year to be able to respond and see those situations as they're happening rather than reacting 10 days later or at the end of the season. And JP, if we think about that example of the parent that reached out, there was somebody in the community or somebody in the program that knew what was going on, and I didn't. And so when I'm starting to think through the questions I'm asking in exit interviews, that's something I'm trying to figure out as well. Are there things that players knew at the time that I didn't? And why did that not get shared with me? Or how did I not bring that out of our players or our captains? And the same thing with our assistant coaches. When we started making some defensive adjustments as we went into the second half of the season, were my assistant coaches sitting on some suggestions or some observations that didn't come out until Christmas break because I didn't create an avenue to get that information from them sooner. So those are things that are even informing some of my interactions with our players and coaches at the end of the year and some of our conversations.
What I love about what you've shared there is that you're not just talking about what did I miss. You're focusing on the underlying system or structure around your team and how you can make changes to have a better chance of identifying that information. Now, when I look at that and changes that we can make, and any change that we can make, from what we did last season to what we do next season, the first thing we have to look at as coaches is our time. How am I spending my time? And what is my capacity as a leader? What's the time capacity of my assistant coaches, my staff, and what's the capacity of our team? Before we just get a list of all these new things all these new initiatives and plans and changes, we have to reflect on our time to first off see where we can actually make changes. And so I oftentimes think that I, as a coach, and I've seen our coaches do this as well, we come up with these grand plans, but then we actually don't have time to implement them. And where do I see coaches veer off course from their plan to fix the culture or their plan to fix their offense or defense? Is time, right? Like all of a sudden we're in the season and matches or games are being played and we have a lack of time and something has to go. And so when we can do an assessment of how we spend our time, down to how I spend my time as a leader, how much time I'm watching film, how much time am I spending in one-on-ones, how much time am I planning practice, how much time am I spending reviewing practice? That's a great one in and of itself. I know we've had Alan Keen on, maybe 100 episodes ago talking about, we spend 3 hours planning a practice, but we only spend 5 minutes reviewing it, and that's probably disproportionate there. But just doing an assessment of our time is really, really, really important so that we can see not just what is our capacity, but are we spending our time on the most important things? The things that are going to produce the best results for our team and that are going to help us to see the greatest return on investment.
Well, I think what you're describing there, JP, is what a lot of us do with our budgets at the end of the year, right? We go back through and we look at where did we actually spend the money, and was that a wise use of our funds? And if not, how do we want to change that for next year, knowing that there's a finite amount of money here for us to spend to be able to benefit our program, our family, what have you. I think related to that, a trap that sometimes coaches fall into is when we start to look for solutions, we start to read books, we start to go out to clinics, we start talking to other coaches, we start investigating, how other programs are doing X, Y, or Z. Sometimes we fail to understand the time limitations or other contextual limitations that we may have in our particular context compared to somebody else. And that can go one of two ways. One, we can go out and say, oh my goodness, the school down the road runs this great full court pressure defense. We should run that defense. Can we put that in, so we absorb it, but we can't commit to the same thing that they're doing, and it's not effective, right? Or we look at it and we say, oh my goodness, JP, they run this great full court defense, but I could never do that because I don't have the athletes and I don't have the time and I don't have the feeder program and I don't have the assistants and our league has too many good guards in it. And it becomes a woe is me reflection rather than starting to piece through a little bit of, well, what makes it successful? What's the fact that they put pressure on the ball? Well, if that's the key, are there ways within our context that we can increase ball pressure? Maybe it's not running the same thing, but it's recognizing what really makes it effective and then trying to apply that within the time constraints, working with our athletes or whatever our context is to be able to still benefit from that without it dominating what we want to do next year or depressing us because we'll never have what they have to work with.
Yeah, I love that. There's I recently shared, a story of Indiana Wesleyan's coach, Greg Tonagel, and at their program, they do a father-son retreat. And I shared it with a few programs as just like, hey, this would be something I think you guys could consider. Now, the initial reaction of some of these coaches was like, oh, that sounds awesome, but where are we going to have the time? Like, we don't have time to do that. And I maybe they don't have time to do a 2-day retreat in the mountains, whitewater rafting, all the things that Tonagel does with his team. They probably don't, okay? But like you said there could be value in it. And what can we do with the time that we have? Well, we have to first know what our time is. And secondly, you might look at it and go, you know what? There was that one weekend we did this, or there was that one off weekend here, or like, and that didn't really actually bring us much benefit. And that could be an opportunity, or we could, mix in the father-son retreat into that moment. And so sitting back and assessing your time, just like with an offensive, or defense or whatever you're running there tactically, same with things we want to do culturally, you can start to see actually opportunities to do things that would have great value for the team. Now, I think the other reflection question I would ask coaches to reflect on, just on their own effectiveness as a leader and what how they should be spending their time, is what can I contribute that will significantly affect the performance or the results of the team? When you look at all the things that we do as coaches, there are things that obviously we have to do. There are things that other people could do, right? But there's things that just have to get done. And some things we'll never be able to offload. But we really want to look at how we spend our time and make sure that we're doing it where it can provide the most value. And some things we can get rid of altogether. Nobody actually needs to do those types of things, that are on the program. Some examples that could be, probably nobody needs to watch 10 hours of film of the upcoming opponent. We may really just need 2 hours of film on a scout to really have a good feel for the team. And I don't actually need to be, as the head coach, need to do that all the time, right? So just that can be applied to a lot of different things. And so I'm reflecting on, what are my strengths? What are my responsibilities, right? But really trying to focus on those strengths and how I can leverage those to contribute significantly to the performance and the results of our team.
Well, I can give you an example of that from our reflections last year, JP, and that was, I felt like I did not watch enough of our own film during the season last year. And so one of the things that we talked about as a staff was, is it possible that I can watch less of our opponents so that I can really dig into our tape, because especially after year one, I had the vision kind of how we wanted to play and what our system should look like and what adjustments we can make. But I would find myself after a Tuesday night game, we do the summaries and you do the media and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, Wednesday, Thursday, my attention is totally shifted to Friday's opponent. And there aren't opportunities for me to reinforce what we did well or what needs to be corrected from Tuesday night. And we kept missing these learning opportunities throughout the year. And I felt like that was exactly what you're describing. That's really only something that I can do as the head coach and the guy that's trying to institute this vision. And the other part of that, JP, is going back to your issue of capacity, wanting to be able to show our kids a little bit more of our own stuff, what we're doing well, what we need to correct, but not making film sessions any longer. In fact, looking at how much time we spent in the classroom watching film last year and thinking that was too much time, and trying to pare that back and figure out how to best spend that time. So some adjustments that we made this year is I watched less of our scouting film than any year in the last 10 years by far. So we divide out our scout. Every assistant coach basically has a game every other week. And so they're going through the film. They're building the scouting report. They're pulling the clips from Huddle. I'm watching the clips, and then I'm asking them, what game should I watch? Or what part of a game should I watch? As they've gone through 3 or 4, maybe I only need to watch the second half of their game last Friday because of what they ran or what the defense ran against them, rather than me combing through 4 or 5 games to find the significant things to prepare me for that next game. Then in the meantime, I can go back through and really cut up our film and try to tease out what are the 20 clips that are going to be most beneficial for our own growth. And I think that's one of the things that's really hard sometimes in coaching is, are we going to benefit more from looking and learning about ourselves or looking and learning at our opponents? And I think I've shifted that pendulum back a little bit towards, I think our greatest value and my greatest use of time is figuring out how to learn more about ourselves and maximize whatever those capabilities might be, rather than spending all of my time giving attention to our opponent as I have in seasons past.
And what I love about an end of the season reflection is you can look at the long-term benefits rather than just the short term. So another example I would share here that I see is how coaches spend their time is just even with practice time. If you say you have on average, 120 minutes of practice time and you've got 50 practices on the year, it is probably, most effective in one practice for you to run the whole thing, you to run every drill because you know exactly how you want it to look and you understand everything and you can bring energy for 120 minutes in that practice. And it's efficient because you don't have to go teach it to your assistants or anything like that. But over the course of 50 practices at 120 minutes, and your players having to listen to the same person, your energy will wane. Their tolerance for hearing your voice constantly day in and day out, and your assistant coaches just sitting on the sidelines, not feeling like they have real ownership. Over the course of 50 practices, it's not the greatest way for you to contribute to the team. And so we need to look at things from the big picture and what we're really trying to achieve.
And I think what you're describing there, JP, is something else that I've been thinking more about this offseason than anyone prior. And that is, I used to be just focused on, the kids have to be taught whatever. We're closing out to the baseline. We have to do that better. Here's where, we're not getting on the top foot, like all the little, details that make that effective or not effective. But the question I haven't asked, JP, is what's going to allow them to hear that message the best? Because maybe it isn't my voice. Maybe it's delegating more of the defense to one of my assistants. Maybe it's through film. Maybe it's through the examples from someone else's film. Like I haven't thought a lot about the method of delivering the message as much as I've just focused on what's the message that they have to hear. And I think that opens up a whole new possibility or realm of possibilities for us to be a better communicating and teaching team, just by thinking maybe my voice isn't always the right one to deliver every message to be received as effectively as possible.
Now, I think the next way we can approach this reflection is to reflect on some of the challenges that we face, some of the obstacles, some of the issues that came up throughout the year. And I've been reading The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker recently, and I really like how he talks about decision making and really trying to evaluate the different types of decisions that we have to make as a leader. And he really breaks it down into kind of 2 different, decisions or challenges that we'll face. And some of those are, the first one is that there are unique challenges. There are unique decisions. They are, very different circumstances. And he actually talks about, JFK during his presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a very unique situation. And what he talks about is that JFK was really, really effective in that moment in handling that decision. But he also talks about all the other decisions that they made during his presidency. And I don't know much about it, but he was saying that they were really ineffective, when it came to the day-to-day and how they ran the White House. Now, when it comes to us as coaches, I think when we look back at our season, we could say, hey, there was, was this a unique challenge, right? For instance, like you may have had a player, or maybe you'll say you have two players that tear their ACL. But in the last 10 years, you haven't had a single player tear their ACL. Do you need to launch this massive ACL, program and rehabbing and get everyone spending 15 to 20 minutes doing, all this type of stuff to prevent ACL injuries? I don't know. Maybe you had a player and there was a drinking incident and, with alcohol, and like that was a big drama of the year and it really sucked the energy out of your team. Is this a common occurrence within your team? Or is this just like this once-off thing? It was just this one individual. When I look at, other things that might be common occurrences though, like you might just be always plagued the last few years with ankle injuries. So you probably should implement something there to actually strengthen ankles or be more preventative there, or consider every player taping their ankle. You might dive into some of the research around the benefits of that. One thing that I see with coaches that is not a once-off, challenge lately is like vaping has become a big thing in not just in the high schools, but in colleges as well. And just like, how do we deal with that? Okay. So when we have these things that are common challenges that are going to continue to occur, now we have to think about, okay, what can we do upstream to try to prevent that from happening? Or what are our processes or our ways of dealing with that when it does come up? Because there are certain things that will just always come up and that we can't prevent. For the unique challenges, it's kind of reflecting on, okay, when we have things that come up that are extraordinary, they are not the normal type of, challenges that we face in a year. Still, what are my guiding principles in those situations?
Well, what you're describing there, it reminds me a lot of our first week of practice. And we've talked about this before on the podcast, where we, over the course of 5 or 6 days, had a kid retire or quit each day. And I've never had anything like that happen in 22 years of coaching. So there is a temptation to say, well, we need to have a retention program here. So we're making sure the kids are staying out, and we, change all these things, whatever those things might be, for their motivation and want to keep them out, whatever. When the reality is, I probably just needed to check in with every kid the week before practice to make sure that they're still planning on playing. Then we would have known before practice started, and it would still be an issue if we're losing that many kids, but it wouldn't have happened over the course of the first week after practice had already started, right? And so I think that's the tension, right? Because we feel a little criticism, we feel a little bit of failure, and so we want to address it and maybe be tempted to blow the whole thing up or implement something brand new, like you talked about, when the reality is maybe there's just a few subtle things that we need to do to gather more information, to be a little bit more informed about where everybody's at going into the season. And at the same time, again, we've talked about this before, but there's a reason why everybody else stayed out, and had a great experience. And I think that's, again, where we just need to have those eyes to be able to see some of these circumstances as, is this a one-off or is this a pattern? And they should be addressed in different ways, depending on the answer to that question.
And one of the last things I kind of want to share today is just around the concept of the 1% rule of, which has been very popularized by James Clear, which is, let's just go get 1% better. And I was recently reading the book about Joe Madden, the Book of Joe, recently. And it's a great book about Joe Madden and his work at the Cubs and the Angels and at Tampa Bay. But one of his guiding principles is do less better. And I think sometimes, and I'm sharing that because I think sometimes we as coaches think, okay, the 1% means 1%. I'm going to do one thing, 1% more. We're going to constantly be adding something to it. And it's like, no, do less better. Make your 1% improvement by sometimes just doing less, and sometimes just whatever little you're doing, refining it. And I think that's the purpose of reviewing, a reflection. Reviewing and reflecting is so that you can make refinements, small 1% improvements in the way that you do something. Not, we need to go and watch more film next year. Not that we need to add an extra practice every week, or we need to add 5 more games to schedule, or we need another 3 weeks in the off season. In the majority, and I would say 99% of sporting experiences out there in the States don't need to do more. That's not the case. We need to do less, and we need to do less better. And so as you're moving through that, I think it's really important to reflect on a few things. First off, what is essential? What is something that you just know is tied to your principles as a coach, to your core values, to who you are, that you will never part from? And make sure you know what is essential. And then to really put everything else on the table, because everything else outside is potentially not essential. It doesn't mean that it's not effective. It doesn't mean it's not helpful. But remember, we only have so much time. And so when we can separate the essential from the non-essential, then we can look at both those things and ask, what could make this more effective? Maybe we do a team retreat at the beginning of the year. Maybe we have, some sort of off-season practice is over the course of, a couple of months. Maybe we have a way of approaching film, like you talked about. Like, there's just every aspect of your program, and be willing to look at everything you do within the program and say, what could we do to make that more effective? How can we do this better? Because everything we can do better. Really, at the end of the day, we can always be better in some things. Now, the energy that might take, or the time it might take to do it better, may not be worth it, but it's worth looking at, how could we do this better? The second thing is, how can we make it more effortless? So how can we, whatever we do, whether it's our scout, can we create templates that make it quicker for coaches? So instead of, every coach doing their scout, it takes them 5 hours. It's only taking them 3 hours. Maybe it's even 4 hours, but we're trying to find ways to make things more effortless. One-on-ones, if we really value one-on-ones with our players, how can we make that so it's not so draining on the coach and doesn't take so much time? So it's coming up with ways to improve our process, our systems of doing things, so that it actually saves us time.
Well, I know that's been a really powerful paradigm shift for me over the last couple of years, JP, in that probably the first 15 years of my career, at the end of a season, I'm constantly asking, what more can we do? And that usually means, what more can we watch? What more can we do in practice? What more can we do in the off season? What more can we do outside of practice? And I'm starting to realize, and I'm a slow learner here, that the better question is, can we get the same result or a better result doing less? Doing less time. Like, we practiced less this year than we have any year in my career. We took more days off this year than any other year in my career. And we had the best season that they've had at Mount Vernon in the last 8-10 years, whatever it's been. And so that's really opened my eyes to trying to become more efficient. Can we get the same result with less time committed or asked of our players? Here's the last thing I want to leave coaches with at the end. You and I have referenced exit interviews, and we could probably do a whole nother episode on that sometime, really diving into what questions matter and how do we create psychological safety and that sort of thing. But one thing that I've realized when doing exit interviews is that I think we go into these and we ask kids about, what do you think about our weightlifting program, and how would we do film differently? And what, we sort of take the pieces of the process and we ask for some reflection for our players. And for a long time, I expected them, like, if they didn't like it, or if there was something that, coach, I think we could do this better, I expected them to have a solution. And we want to be solution oriented, right? But here's the reality that I've started to change how I ask these questions. Players don't know anything, JP. Like, they're not spending the next 10 months just thinking about how to be more effective in a 20-minute film session. They're not thinking about basketball at all, quite frankly, once the season gets over with. So to expect a kid to say, I'm not sure if I got stronger, and then for them to have a different weightlifting program that would make us stronger, is a ridiculous expectation in my mind. And I used to get frustrated by that, where they'd say, we didn't like this, and they'd have no solutions. And then I'd get mad at them. I wouldn't say it, but in my mind, I'm like, oh, we're just going to complain here and you're not going to take any ownership over this. So that's exactly the opposite of what I wanted here. And now the way that I phrase it is, do you have any suggestions or ideas, or is this something that you want the coaches to invest some time in thinking about in the off season? And that was really beneficial for us last year to identify a couple areas where I think this could be done differently. We're not really sure how, but yeah, that's a great thing for the coaching staff to think and talk more about. And that was really great for us without putting all this pressure on the kids to feel like they have to have the answers.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. I hope you get intentional in your reflection process this offseason. If you are interested in some support in that process, check out our one-on-one coaching program. You can learn more at tocculture.com or by emailing me at jpnerbun, N-E-R-B-U-N, at tocculture.com. Thanks to everyone who continues to listen in every week, and thanks to everyone who has taken the time to leave a review of our podcast. And also, thanks to everyone who takes the time to share episodes of the podcast, whether that's on social media or just texting links to friends and coaching and family members out there.